Hey friends, welcome back. We are back for the second half of chapter 2. This video is going to be on ethics and sustainability, distinct but related concepts. So we're going to focus a little bit more on the ethics piece, and then I would encourage you to check out the extra resources on Blackboard that talk a little bit more about sustainability. So let's start here. So the question here that I'm going to pose to you at the beginning of this discussion is, should e-cigarettes or vaporizers be marketed like any other widely available consumer product, like milk or music or clothing? So think about that just for a second. Okay, I hope you have your answer. We're going to move on. So usually I have some people say, a few people say yes, a few people say no. So let's look at some examples of e-cigarette vaporizer advertising. So here's an example. Here's an example of some vaporizers. Here's another example. Okay, here's a Santa example. So there's a question among many about whether e-cigarettes and vaporizers should be marketed like any other product, or if they should have restrictions on them similar to those that are on tobacco products. Tobacco products cannot use childlike advertising. They can't have characters in their advertising like the old Joe Camel. They can't have, there's a lot of places that they can't advertise, like TV. Generally, you don't see them on a lot of billboards. That's pretty limited. Pretty much the only place you really see advertising for cigarettes and other tobacco products these days is in adult magazines, right? Not X-rated magazines, but like Men's Health, probably not Men's Health, a car magazine maybe, and Glamour or Cosmo or something on the other end. Newsweek maybe. There are a variety of different places, but it has to be something that's not targeted at children. So there's a bunch of restrictions. Tobacco companies got in tons of trouble in the 90s because of class action lawsuits and have had to give billions of dollars to state governments and then the state governments use it to put into place anti-smoking campaigns for like kids and teenagers. So the question is, should there be similar restrictions? It's not exactly the same product, but it might be addictive, certainly. Does it have the same harmful effects as tobacco or as our traditional tobacco products? We don't know, is the answer. There's been some studies, but there's not a ton of research on it yet. But certainly it is limited to adults to be able to even purchase these products. But should we have marketing or packaging that is something that would be attractive to children? Right. I thought it was really interesting when I found this ad of Santa Claus, because there's actually an ad that I saw from probably the 60s it's very, very similar, where it's Santa Claus with a cigarette, and it was a tobacco company advertising. This is the cigarette brand that Santa Claus smokes. And so I just thought this was a really interesting parallel to that. So I don't know what the answer is, but I wouldn't be surprised if we do see some restrictions come down upon these companies specifically. So ethics is a pretty important part of marketing. There are a variety of different policies and laws and governing bodies in place. There are federal laws, there are state laws, there are trade associations. So a lot of times companies don't like the government to come tell them what to do or not to do. So a lot of companies will do what they call self-regulation, and there's two ways to do this. One is simply that the company decides, here are our standards, our own internal standards, and we are not going to, we're going to follow our guidelines. We're not going to go outside of those. There's also trade associations that will have different guidelines. There's a big to-do, I think it was the early 90s, about advertising liquor on television. And for a long time, the trade association had banned it. The trade association said, we're not going to do it. We don't think it's appropriate. And we think if we start doing it, then the government might put more restrictions on liquor companies. And eventually the liquor companies decided and worked with the trade association and just said, we don't think that this is the right way to go. We think we should be able to advertise on television. It was a really big deal. There's a lot of, parent groups and different groups around the country that were really upset that when the trade association changed their rules. But the whole idea behind the trade association having rules in the first place was to avoid, to say like these are our standards as liquor producers, and we're not going to veer away from those until, unless we actually change the rules. But our companies that are part of the trade association are going to abide by these rules, and we're going to make the rules because we can all make, the liquor companies can make them together as the association, rather than having the government come and say, we don't care what you think, these are the rules. Sometimes that happens, but a lot of companies do try to engage in this self-regulation so as to prevent further regulation being placed upon them. If companies do engage in unethical actions, whether that's from an advertising to children perspective or deceptive pricing strategies or quality issues. A few years ago, there's a big to-do about Taco Bell, and that came out that their meat is only 40% actual meat, and it has a bunch of filler products in it. So that was briefly scandalous. Obviously, they're still in business, but that was definitely at least a temporary blow to their profits. So there are marketplace consequences for low ethical standards. We have Enron, who got completely shut down. A lot of, we do see a lot of boycotts, or just, it doesn't even have to be a boycott, right? Taco Bell says, find out that 60% of Taco Bell's meat is not meat. There's gonna be a little while where people just don't go there for a while. With Nike and a bunch of other big companies, there were some, they made some changes, but there have been a wide variety of brief declines in revenues and profits for companies because they've been caught engaging in unethical behaviors. With Nike and a bunch of other of the big companies I think it was the 90s, when it came to light that they were using sweatshop labor. That was a big deal, and they ended up having to make some major changes to their practices. So we need to be careful as marketers to make sure that we are making ethical decisions. How do we know if something's ethical, right? Is it the law that defines ethics? Is it the company that defines ethics? If you remember nothing else from this video, this is what I want you to remember. What is unethical is not always illegal. There are plenty of things that are technically, by the letter of the law, that might still be unethical. Okay. A lot of times firms will create their own code of ethics, or there will be a code of ethics from their trade association or something similar. But these are just these basic values that would guide the firm's behavior. And it's so important to have these. It is so simple in this day and age for information to be distributed, that when, a scandal hits, everyone in the country can find out about it in an hour. because of social media. Okay. The AMA, the American Marketing Association, has a code of ethics for marketers. It includes these values here, which are pretty common in codes of ethics or principles that companies have. Their ethical norms are going to be things like don't do anything that's harmful. And also make sure your actions foster trust in the marketing system. We don't want people to be doing things that, make people think that we're trying to unethically, that just erodes trust in the system altogether, right? That makes people think that all marketers are bad. For example, the company that I used to work at, we had our guiding principles. Now, lots of companies have these. Some companies actually it's part of the fabric of the company itself. It's really woven in and integrated. Other companies just really just a list that sits on a website somewhere. I would say in the case of the company I worked at, Coke, these are emphasized at every single day. These principles absolutely 100% guide the behavior of everything from management all the way down to workers in a factory to analysts sitting in a cubicle like me. Integrity is the most important one for the company. They say even if it means we lose profits, we will always act with integrity. Humility, I think, is such an interesting one. Very rarely, I think, would you see that on a list of principles. And then compliance is the second one for a reason. Those are the most important ones, and they're really big on that. And I think that it's a good example of a company that actually lives its values and tries to be ethical, right? It has its code of ethics that it does emphasize for employees. We were talking about in the previous video about international marketing. One thing that we run into there is this question of bribes. Is it acceptable to bribe an official in another country to get the permit to build the factory or to hire those workers or whatnot? The reality is that in some countries, a bribe is the only way to get things done, because that is the norm of the country. It is the social norm. The only way that you're going to move through the red tape is to bribe someone. Now, technically, US law does ban bribes. If you're an American company, even if you're overseas, you still have to abide by this law. However, with that said, there are certainly many, many instances where companies would go ahead and engage in this because it is the social, even if it's not the law of the land that they're in, is the social norm that they're in. I just think this is interesting. I haven't been able to find this since a few years ago, obviously you can see, but they used to do this transparency bribe payers index. So you can see sort of the countries where there's the fewest bribes. And then you can see that it gets, kind of go down from there, Netherlands and Switzerland and Belgium being up at the top. And then you can see the US ranks number 10. China and Russia are 28 and 27 and 28. And then this is just a visual representation of that same thing. So the lighter colors means less bribery, the bribery is less so the norm. Darker colors means it's more the norm. Ethics also falls into this idea of criticisms of marketing that I mentioned in the first chapter. There are a lot of criticisms of marketing. Again, a lot of companies try to push back against these because sometimes sometimes companies make choices that make people feel like these are absolutely true. But certainly they're not true of every company, and those companies give the rest of us a bad name. But this is a couple of them I want to touch on. Really, the biggest one is this idea of planned obsolescence. This is the concept that companies might make a product that they know is going to break down in a certain period of time, a relatively short period of time, and they know that you're going to buy a new one. Probably the one that people would think of, whether this is planned obsolescence or not, is like cell phones. I don't know if even, and there are real reasons, like technology gets better and you need more space on a phone to run the operating system, so your old phone just can't run that new update, right? But is it the case that these phone companies are producing phones that they know will basically be obsolete in 2, 3, maybe 4 years, and then you won't be able, it will effectively be non-functional because it will be so slow trying to run that updated operating system that you can't use it at all, and you just you're forced to buy a new one. Okay. And then another one I just really wanted to touch on is this idea of easy consumer credit, making people buy things that they don't need, that they can't afford. You see this with car companies, no credit, no problem, right? Certainly there are lenders and companies that prey upon people that might be in a situation where they don't have good credit. And so then these predatory lenders can charge exorbitant interest rates. On the flip side, you have, payday lenders or no credit, no problem kind of auto dealerships or whatnot. Now, maybe for some people, it's actually worth it to have to pay a higher interest rate, not an exorbitant interest rate, not crazy high, but a relatively high interest rate in order to get that car that enables you to get to work and make money. So those things do have to sort of be balanced. If you look at your credit card, I'm going to challenge you to go look at your credit card and see what the interest rate is. A lot of them are around 25%. And that's your major credit card companies: Discover, MasterCard, Bank of America, all of those people. Their interest rates are oftentimes 20 to 25%. So if you have a leftover balance on your credit card of $100, you get the bill in the mail in the next month. Now it's $125. And so it can get people in a position where they're stuck. Certainly people have the agency to make those decisions. And again, for some people in emergencies or depending on their situation, it may be necessary. It may provide a product that gives them value, even though they have to pay a 25% interest rate or whatever it is, okay? Certainly, soapbox time. I wish we had a personal finance class that was a requirement for every college student. I think that would be a really wise thing to do, but no one asked me. So if someone asks me, that's what I would say. Consumers should be informed of, have the information about the things that they're purchasing or the payday loans that they're getting, so that they know what they're getting into, what the interest rate is going to be, what the payment looks like, so that consumers can make good decisions. Okay. In terms of advertising ethics, here we hear things like deceptive advertising. Usually, if someone is going to sue for deceptive advertising, the standard is this idea of a reasonable consumer. Would this ad cause a reasonable consumer to change their behavior and purchase or not purchase a product based on the ad? It is a hard standard to meet. For example, you might go into a department store and you see a sign that says clearance. Clearance $2 or something. And then you get closer to the sign and you realize that underneath in small print, it says and up. All right. So you thought that it was everything on that rack was $2, but it's not. It's at $2 and up. Those have been around for a long time. As far as I'm aware, they do not constitute deceptive advertising, despite what my mother feels like. And, as a reasonable consumer, you should see that that fine print is there. One of my favorite, in that it's an interesting thing, are shock ads. These are ads that are, generally speaking, not illegal, though there have been some cases where they've been forced to take these ads down. But these ads are designed to be shocking, right? Consumers see hundreds of ads a day, thousands upon thousands of ads in a year. It is very hard to break through all of that and get a consumer to pay attention to an ad. So companies sometimes resort to really shocking, typically images, to get people's attention. So I'm just going to show you a few of them. We're not going to talk about all of them. One of the maybe most well-known is United Colors of Benetton. They do a lot of shock advertising. One of the campaigns they did a few years ago was called Sentenced to Death. And in this campaign, they went to Missouri, and the subjects in the pictures here, the models, if you will, are actually convicted criminals who are on death row. These are actual death row inmates that were featured in these ads. The company said that they were trying to bring attention and raise awareness of the death penalty. The victims or victims' families, as you can imagine, were rather upset about a company profiting off of the murder or whatever of a family member. And so they sued United Colors of Benetton, and I believe it resulted in eventually a settlement where the company paid several $1 million into like a victims fund in Missouri. Some of these I don't know a lot about. I just think they're really interesting. So fashion, all kinds of different companies use this. We see this in PSAs. So the next two are actually PSAs. Okay. If this one at the very bottom says, if you don't feed them, who will? This is actually an ad for like foster care services or trying to get foster parents. This is a gelato ad. Okay. This is several years old. But I just think it's a very interesting ad for gelato, right? This one by Dolce & Gabbana. This one was originally produced in Italy and Spain, I believe. They ended up taking this one down, not because, as I recall, not because they were required to by the government, but because there was so much backlash about this symbolizing gang rape that they ended up taking it down. Their response, despite the fact that they took it down, their response was that this is probably my favorite one. This is an ad for knives and a toaster. So definitely shocking. Okay. All right. So that kind of ends our advertising segment. So let's switch into sustainability. Sustainability, of course, is this, you guys know what sustainability is. The idea here, though, is that companies should try to pursue what they call the triple bottom line, where effectively they're doing good, but it's also a good thing for the company, right? Where sustainability is just sensible business. It just makes sense because it is good for the company. Here's one example that H&M used to do, at least. They had this recycling program for clothing. It is some absurd amount of clothing. I can't remember the figure right now, of clothing that ends up being trashed. There is this, kind of life cycle of clothes, is that someone buys them, they wear them, especially like something trendy, wear it for maybe a year, then they donate it to Goodwill or some other place, kind of Salvation Army or something. Then it either goes to a Goodwill store and is purchased by someone else in that same, area or country, Sometimes they're shipped overseas to places like refugee camps, which is a whole nother story. When a lot of clothes are donated, they end up being sent places like refugee camps, like in Tanzania. What ends up happening a lot of times is that those clothes that are given out for free destroys the local economy of clothing makers in the local area. The same thing has been, same kind of accusations have been leveled at Tom's Shoes, that they donate these shoes. So now the local person who, shop owner or even shoemaker is out of business because all the kids got their shoes for free from Tom's Shoes. So there is a whole nother question about whether or not the whole cycle of donating clothes, especially overseas, is actually doing good. A lot of those, sometimes, there's a good percentage of them, they actually end up getting shipped back to the United States, and then they get thrown away in the trash anyways. So there is a big question about what do we do about disposing of items like clothing. There is a movement to buy more high quality clothing, have fewer clothes, but higher quality that would last longer, so you're not throwing as much away. That hasn't taken off quite yet, but I know there's some movement in that direction. Another example from the company that I used to work with is we co-owned Georgia Pacific, which is a paper product company like Angel Soft Toilet Paper that I mentioned before. And paper plants are incredibly, there's a lot of waste because we want to recycle paper and cardboard, right? That's a great thing to do. But what happens is then that paper and cardboard comes in and there's a lot of ink on it. So before they can do anything to turn it back into another paper product, all of that ink has to be pulled out. There's a lot of water that's used, but that ink and all the waste from that process is called black sludge. That's what it looks like. And it's kind of gross. And so for a long time, companies didn't really know what to do with it. Not at Coke, but I'm sure there have been examples where there's unethical disposal. We hear lots of things about unethical disposal of like waste products from factories and things like that. So what they figured out was that they could actually utilize that black sludge as fuel to run the plant. And eventually the EPA and the government decided that this was such a good idea that they were going to offer millions of dollars in tax credits to companies to do this. And the company I had worked for had already been doing it for maybe 4 years at that point. So that's one way that they were doing good, but it was also sensible business, right? Because now they didn't have to pay for oil and gas or, coal, electricity to run the plant. When we think about developing a sustainable marketing mix, again, we're thinking of those basically 4 Ps plus your target market, your overarching 5th P of people, right? And in each area, you can really examine, are there sustainable things that we can change or add to each of these? Is it that we can change the packaging to reduce the amount of packaging? That's good for us because we don't have to pay for as much packaging, right? Or that it would be recyclable or be something that they can actually turn back in that we can reuse. Is it a pricing strategy where at H&M where you can get a discount if you come in and bring clothes to donate, or Target or other places where if you bring your own bag in, you get a very small discount instead of using their bags. In terms of place and distribution, right, this may be even looking at how things are transported to different places, whether that is on semi trucks or railroad or whatnot. And then our promotion strategies kind of tie back into that pricing example. But, letting consumers know what we're doing, but also just from like an actual practical standpoint of, can we create a really great advertisement flyer or mailer that we're going to send out that doesn't require the entire thing to have, be in color and inked. You may have seen there's some little postcard kind of ads that I've gotten in the past. They actually, at the bottom, it says like, this is a sustainable product. Embedded within this are wildflower seeds. So if you go plant this postcard in your front yard, then wildflowers will grow, which I think is just a really creative and interesting strategy. So in general, we are looking for sustainable practices that are also good for business. Those are going to be the ones that are the most, for lack of a better word, sustainable. Things that we can actually continue doing over the long term, rather than just a push for publicity that, doesn't actually last in the long term. And we end up switching back to something we were doing before. The other thing would be thinking about encouraging sustainable consumer behavior, like having the way H&M gives a discount if you bring the clothes, or Target with the plastic bags. How can we encourage sustainable consumer behavior, consumption behavior, which can even include disposing of products, in a way that is encouraging and incentivizes consumers to make good decisions in that regard, without, forcing them to, or being overbearing. So kind of looking at our choices, and then also how can we communicate that to the consumer. All right, and that's it for chapter 2. I'll see you back again for chapter 3. Have a great night.